He thought his badge made him untouchable until he brought the wrong woman to court. The officer walked through the streets of his small city with the kind of confidence that made people move out of his way before he even said a word. His badge gleamed under the sun, polished almost every morning, not because he cared for cleanliness but because he loved the way it caught the light. For him, that badge was more than just a piece of metal. It was his shield, his crown, and his ticket to being respected, or rather feared, by almost everyone he met. He had been in the force for several years now, and in that time, he had built a reputation. To the public, he was strict and commanding, someone who never let a rule slide. But those who had crossed his path in the wrong way knew a different side of him. He carried himself with arrogance, as though the badge made him untouchable. If he told someone to stand still, they froze. If he demanded answers, they stammered. And if anyone dared to question his authority, he found ways to make their lives harder. Over time, this attitude became his comfort. He didn't see himself as just another officer doing a job. He saw himself as the law itself. In his eyes, his uniform gave him the right to walk taller, speak louder, and silence anyone who challenged him. People could sense it in the way he entered a room. Even in casual settings, his presence was heavy, as though the badge was speaking for him, reminding everyone that he had power others didn't. He liked that power, maybe a little too much. At first, it had started with small things: cutting the line at the grocery store because he was busy on duty, demanding free coffee at the diner because he wore the uniform, or glaring at neighbors until they quickly changed their tone in any argument. He got used to these little privileges, and soon, they weren't enough. He began stretching the lines of authority, bending rules for his own gain, and reminding people in subtle ways that he was not a man to be crossed. Yet for all his confidence, there was something else behind it. He believed no one would dare stop him. In his mind, who would challenge a man with a badge? His fellow officers respected him, not because they admired him, but because they didn't want to get on his bad side. Citizens avoided him, not because they trusted him, but because they feared what he might do if they didn't. And the system, at least in his view, would always side with him. When he walked into the station each morning, he carried himself like someone stepping onto a stage. He greeted people with a sharp nod, rarely smiling, as if to remind them he was all business. His desk was always spotless, his boots shining, his reports filed in neat piles. But beneath that picture of order was a man who was slowly convincing himself that he could never be touched by the same laws he enforced on others. There were stories about him, stories whispered at the bar late at night or murmured in the corners of the courthouse hallways. People said he was quick to hand out tickets to those who annoyed him, that he sometimes stretched the truth in his reports, and that he always seemed to win in situations where ordinary folks would have no chance. No one ever said these things loudly, though. Speaking against him was risky. He had ways of making people regret crossing him. It wasn't just his actions that made him intimidating, it was the way he carried himself. He had a sharp stare, the kind that made people shift uncomfortably even if they had done nothing wrong. His voice carried a tone of finality, as if every word he spoke was the last word on the matter. When he asked a question, it didn't sound like a question at all, it sounded like a demand. And when he smiled, which was rare, it wasn't a warm smile. It was a knowing one, the kind that said, "I already have the upper hand." Despite his outward strength, though, there were cracks in his armor, cracks only a few could see. He had grown so used to being in control that he no longer knew how to react when someone didn't flinch. When a citizen met his stare with calmness or questioned him with confidence, something inside him stirred. He didn't like it. It threatened the image he had built of himself. That was why he worked so hard to maintain his authority, to silence any opposition before it could grow. This way of living had become normal to him. Day after day, he stepped into his uniform like it was a costume, preparing for another performance where he played the role of the untouchable man. He didn't even notice anymore how people avoided conversations with him or how neighbors lowered their eyes when he walked past. To him, that was respect. He didn't see the fear, the discomfort, or the quiet resentment. All he saw was obedience, and that fed his pride. But the truth was, this pride was built on fragile ground. For years, he had been stacking moments of arrogance one on top of another, never realizing how unstable the tower had become. All it would take was one unexpected challenge, one person who didn't fit the usual pattern, to make it crumble. And while he believed that day would never come, it was already waiting for him just around the corner. He had no idea that soon, he would meet someone who didn't bend to his authority, someone who wouldn't be silenced by his badge or intimidated by his stare. For now, though, he walked through life untouchable, his arrogance growing stronger, and his belief in his own power becoming almost unshakable. That morning, as he pinned the badge to his chest and looked at himself in the mirror, he saw a man in full control. He straightened his uniform, adjusted his belt, and gave himself a small nod of approval. To him, it was another day where the world would bend to his will. He had no idea that fate was about to test him in a way he had never imagined. The day that would change everything for him began in an ordinary way. The officer arrived at the station, carrying the same confidence he always wore like armor. His boots struck the floor with a sharp rhythm, his badge gleamed in the hallway light, and his eyes scanned the room with the quiet authority that made colleagues nod but never truly smile in his presence. To him, it was just another day to remind people of his power. That morning, he had no real emergencies to deal with. The city was quiet, the streets calm, and the reports coming in were routine. For a man like him, though, quiet days felt dull. He thrived on confrontation, on situations where he could prove his authority. So when a minor dispute reached his desk, a disagreement between a woman and a local business, he didn't assign it to anyone else. He took it for himself, sensing an opportunity to assert his presence. The call seemed small on the surface. A woman had stood up to a store manager who accused her of being in the wrong over a receipt issue. Normally, it would have been handled with a calm conversation or a quick mediation. But when the officer arrived, he didn't see a chance to resolve the issue peacefully. He saw a chance to remind someone what it meant to stand against him. The woman was calm, standing her ground with a quiet firmness. She explained her side clearly, her voice steady, her words chosen carefully. She didn't shout or lose her temper, and she didn't shrink when the officer's sharp eyes landed on her. That alone unsettled him. Most people, when faced with his stare and his presence, would falter, fumble their words, or at least look away. But she didn't. She looked him straight in the eye, and in that moment, he felt a flicker of irritation. Rather than listening, he let his pride take over. He saw her confidence as defiance, her calmness as disrespect. He convinced himself that she was challenging not only the store manager but his authority as well. In his mind, that couldn't be allowed. So he made a choice that morning, a choice that would set everything in motion. He decided to press charges against her for disorderly conduct, a decision that turned a simple dispute into a legal battle. She didn't shout or argue when he announced his decision. She simply raised an eyebrow, as though she was seeing something she had expected all along. That look unsettled him more than any words could have. Still, he carried out his role with the confidence of a man who believed no one could stand against him. He filled out the report, added his own version of events, and escorted her with the kind of formality that made him feel powerful. To those watching, it was strange. The woman wasn't causing a scene, yet the officer treated her as though she were a threat to order. Some bystanders exchanged uneasy glances, whispering to each other that the situation seemed excessive. But none of them spoke up. They knew better. They knew how quickly their own lives could become complicated if they dared question him. At the station, the process was swift. He filed paperwork with confidence, convinced that everything would go his way. After all, it always had before. Judges respected his reports, colleagues backed his word, and citizens rarely had the means to fight him in court. To him, this was just another routine case, another reminder that his badge carried more weight than any defense someone could put forward. What he didn't notice, however, was the woman's composure throughout the ordeal. She didn't show fear, and she didn't plead for leniency. She watched quietly, observing each step, as though she were taking mental notes. While he mistook her silence for defeat, it was something else entirely. She was letting him build his case, confident that the truth would reveal itself in due time. The officer left that day with a sense of triumph. In his mind, he had silenced another challenger, shown the public that defiance came with consequences, and reminded everyone around him of his reach. He told himself he had done his duty, protecting order and upholding the law, even though deep down he knew it had been more about pride than justice. As the days passed and the court date approached, his confidence only grew. He spoke casually to colleagues about the case, painting the woman as difficult and unreasonable. Some officers nodded along, while others shifted uncomfortably, unsure if his story truly matched the reality. But none of them dared confront him. His reputation was too strong, and his influence too heavy. Meanwhile, the woman prepared quietly, away from the officer's sight. She didn't complain publicly, nor did she try to clear her name through gossip. Instead, she focused on gathering what she needed, letting the officer believe he held all the cards. She knew his type: men who thought their badge or position made them immune to consequences. She had met them before, and she knew patience often revealed their weakness. On the morning of the hearing, the officer walked into the courthouse with his usual swagger. His uniform was perfectly pressed, his badge polished, his belt adjusted just right. He carried himself as though the outcome was already decided, as though the courtroom was simply another stage where he would perform his authority. To him, this was a formality, a show that would end with yet another victory. But even as he smiled to himself, the atmosphere around him carried a subtle shift. People in the courthouse looked at him differently that day. Some seemed curious, others cautious, as though they sensed that something unusual was about to unfold. The woman arrived shortly after, dressed simply but neatly, her posture calm, her eyes focused. She didn't glance away when he looked at her. Instead, she met his stare with the same quiet confidence she had shown before. The officer felt the flicker of irritation again, stronger this time. But he brushed it aside. To him, the courtroom was his ground. He had been here many times before, and the system had always stood on his side. Why should this time be any different? He didn't realize it yet, but this was the moment the balance began to shift. By bringing her to court, he believed he was tightening his grip on control. In reality, he was stepping onto ground where his badge meant less than he imagined. The courtroom wasn't a street corner where his voice silenced arguments, nor was it a hallway where his stare made people back down. It was a place where truth had its own weight, and where arrogance could become a man's undoing. The woman knew it. She didn't need to raise her voice or point fingers. She only needed to wait, to let the process unfold, and to reveal, piece by piece, who she truly was. The officer, blind to all of this, sat confidently, ready for what he thought would be another easy victory. What he didn't know was that this was not just any woman, and this was not just any case. By pressing charges against her, he had set himself on a path that would expose more than he ever intended. His belief that his badge made him untouchable was about to face its first true test, and for the first time in his career, he was walking into a battle he couldn't win by intimidation alone. The morning of the trial was filled with quiet tension. The officer arrived early, walking through the courthouse doors with the same pride that had carried him for years. His boots echoed against the polished floors, each step loud and confident, as if the sound itself announced his importance. He carried a small stack of papers under his arm: reports, statements, and documents that he believed would secure the case. In his mind, This was going to be just another victory, another moment to remind everyone that his word carried more weight than anyone else's. He adjusted his uniform carefully before stepping into the courtroom. The badge gleamed on his chest, polished to perfection. To him, the sight of it was a reminder of the authority he carried. He believed it would speak for him before he even opened his mouth. As he walked past, a few people glanced at him, some with curiosity, others with unease. He misread their looks as admiration. The woman entered a short while later. She wasn't dressed in anything flashy, but there was something in her presence that made people turn to look. She carried herself with calmness, each step measured, her eyes steady. Unlike others who had faced the officer before, she showed no trace of fear. She didn't lower her gaze or shift uncomfortably. She simply walked to her seat, set down her small folder of documents, and waited quietly. The officer noticed her calmness again, and it unsettled him just like it had the first time. He told himself it didn't matter. Confidence in ordinary people always faded once the process began. He had seen it many times before, strong voices turning shaky, steady hands beginning to tremble, defiance shrinking under pressure. He was certain she would be no different. When the proceedings began, the officer rose with authority, giving his side of the story with practiced ease. His voice was firm, his sentences clear, and his tone carried that sense of finality he had mastered over the years. He presented his version of events as though it were the only truth. He spoke about order, about respect, and about how rules had been broken. His words painted the woman as disruptive, unreasonable, and unwilling to cooperate. For a while, the courtroom seemed to lean in his direction. People nodded slightly, scribbling notes. The officer felt the familiar swell of pride. This was his arena, and he knew how to control it. He glanced at the woman, expecting to see her uneasy or flustered. But she sat quietly, her expression calm, her hands resting lightly on the table. That calmness made him speak even louder, as though raising his voice would finally break her composure. When it was her turn to respond, the room shifted. She didn't raise her voice, didn't rush through her words, and didn't try to match his tone. Instead, she spoke slowly and clearly, addressing the court with respect, laying out her side of the story piece by piece. She explained the events without exaggeration, presenting her actions as reasonable and fair. Her voice carried no anger, only steadiness, and the more she spoke, the more the courtroom leaned toward her. The officer frowned slightly. He had expected resistance, maybe even tears or frustration, but not this. There was something different in the way she presented herself, something almost professional. It didn't feel like she was defending herself for the first time, it felt like she knew exactly what she was doing. As she continued, small cracks began to appear in the officer's case. Questions were raised about details he had written in his report. Timelines didn't align perfectly, and some descriptions seemed exaggerated. Normally, such things would be overlooked because of his status, but with her calm explanations, those small cracks became visible. The judge began to look at him differently, asking for clarifications, pressing him for details he hadn't expected to defend. The officer tried to brush them off with confidence, but each time he did, the woman quietly countered with facts, documents, or observations that weakened his position. She didn't attack him directly, but every word she spoke seemed to shine a light on the flaws in his story. By midday, the officer felt something he hadn't felt in years: pressure. It wasn't the kind of pressure that came from a chaotic situation on the street. This was different. It was the weight of losing control in a place where his badge couldn't silence the questions. He shifted in his chair, his jaw tightening, his fingers drumming against the table. The woman remained steady, her calm presence a sharp contrast to his growing frustration. She didn't need to raise her voice or show anger, her quiet confidence was enough. The more composed she appeared, the more unsettled he became. For the first time, he realized that his usual tactics, authority, intimidation, and presence held no power here. As the afternoon continued, the courtroom atmosphere grew heavier. Spectators leaned forward, sensing that something unusual was happening. It wasn't common to see an officer's testimony questioned so carefully, and it wasn't common to see a defendant so composed. Whispers passed quietly through the benches, people exchanging glances as they watched the balance slowly shift. The officer tried one last time to regain control, raising his voice and framing his words with authority. But instead of silencing the room, it only highlighted the contrast between him and the woman. His loudness sounded defensive, while her steady responses sounded credible. The judge, noting this, leaned toward her side with more interest. At one point, when asked how she seemed so prepared, the woman simply smiled faintly and said, "I trust in the process, and I believe in the truth." Her words were simple, but they carried weight. The officer felt his chest tighten. Something about her confidence didn't feel like ordinary bravery. It felt like knowledge of the system, of the law, and of him. By the end of the day, the officer sat in his chair, less certain than when he had arrived. His papers felt lighter in his hands, his badge suddenly less shiny. He still told himself he was in control, that this was only a temporary setback. But deep down, a quiet unease grew stronger. He had brought her here expecting an easy win, expecting her to break under pressure. Instead, she had stood firm, exposing cracks in his authority that he had never imagined anyone would dare touch. The courtroom had not become the stage for his triumph, it had become the place where his confidence was quietly tested, piece by piece. And though he couldn't see the full picture yet, the truth was beginning to unfold. The woman was not just any defendant, and this was not just any trial. Her calmness was not ordinary, it came from experience, from knowledge, and from a position of strength that he had yet to fully discover. As the court adjourned for the day, the officer walked out with slower steps than usual. His boots still echoed against the floor, but the sound no longer felt like a declaration of power. It felt like a reminder that his authority, for the first time, had limits. And somewhere in the quiet corners of his mind, a thought began to whisper, maybe his badge didn't make him as untouchable as he believed. The second day of the hearing began with a quiet uneasiness in the air. The officer walked into the courtroom with the same polished look he always carried, but something about him was different. His steps were slower, his eyes darted around more often, and though he still wore his badge with pride, the confidence behind it didn't feel as strong as before. The courtroom, once his stage, was beginning to turn into a place of doubt. The woman was already seated, calm and steady as always. She had arrived early, greeting the clerk politely, arranging her papers in neat order, and sitting in silence. There was no sign of nervousness in her body language. She seemed to know exactly where she was and what she was about to do. The people in the room noticed it. They whispered quietly among themselves, surprised by her composure. It wasn't the usual scene they had come to expect when someone stood against the officer. When the proceedings began, the officer repeated his earlier claims, adding more detail in hopes of strengthening his case. His voice was firm, his sentences long, and he tried to frame the story so that it would leave little room for doubt. He believed that repeating his version would seal the cracks that had begun to show. But the judge's face was more serious this time, and the questions asked were sharper, more direct. Then it was the woman's turn again. She stood up, not with loudness or theatrics, but with a steady calm that filled the room. She began by addressing the points he had raised, one by one, showing inconsistencies in his report. She had papers to back her words, and each document seemed to match perfectly with the story she told. The officer shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening as she spoke. And then came the turning point. The woman introduced herself fully. She explained that she was not simply a citizen caught in an argument, but a federal attorney who had worked on cases of misconduct and abuse of authority. Her words fell into the room like a stone dropped into still water. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the scribbling of pens as people hurried to take notes. The officer froze for a moment. His mind raced, but his face struggled to stay composed. He hadn't seen this coming. To him, she had been just another person he could overpower with his badge. But now, it was clear she was not only experienced in the law, she was part of it, someone who understood the system far better than he ever had. She continued calmly, laying out evidence that questioned not only this incident but his pattern of behavior. She mentioned records, reports, and complaints that had been brushed aside in the past, now brought into the light. With each point she raised, the courtroom leaned further in her favor. The judge's eyes narrowed, asking questions that pressed harder on the officer's actions. The officer tried to defend himself, but the confidence in his voice began to fade. Each time he spoke, the woman had a clear, precise counter. Each time he tried to frame himself as the authority, she gently reminded the court of facts that showed otherwise. It was no longer a contest of who sounded stronger, it was a matter of who carried the truth. Spectators could feel the shift. The man who had always seemed untouchable was being questioned in ways no one had seen before. Whispers moved through the benches as people exchanged looks of surprise. Some nodded slightly, as if relieved to see that someone had finally stood up to him. The officer's heart pounded as she spoke about his past. She didn't attack with anger, she simply presented records, complaints from citizens, inconsistencies in his reports, and small abuses of authority that had gone unnoticed for years. Each piece was like a crack spreading across a wall, slowly breaking down the image of the powerful man he had built for himself. He tried to speak louder, to take back control, but the louder he grew, the more defensive he sounded. His words no longer carried the weight of authority, they carried the desperation of someone who felt his shield slipping away. For the first time, the badge on his chest didn't seem to shine as brightly. The woman finished with quiet strength. She reminded the court that the law was meant to protect people, not to be used as a weapon of intimidation. Her words were simple but powerful. The room fell silent again, and the officer felt the silence pressing down on him. It was the silence of realization, the silence of truth settling in. The judge looked at him differently now. No longer with the automatic respect that came from his uniform, but with the seriousness of someone questioning whether the man before him had abused the trust given to him. The officer swallowed hard, his throat dry. He knew in that moment that this was no longer a case he controlled. As the day ended, the officer walked out of the courtroom slower than he had entered. His shoulders, once square with pride, now felt heavy. His steps, once confident and loud, now dragged slightly. People in the hallway looked at him not with fear but with curiosity, even pity. The whispers followed him, and for the first time, they weren't whispers of fear, they were whispers of doubt. He had thought his badge made him untouchable. For years, it had shielded him from questions, silenced opposition, and granted him power. But here, in this courtroom, it had no power over truth. And the woman he had underestimated had revealed that truth piece by piece, until there was no denying it. That night, the officer sat alone, replaying the day in his mind. The calmness in her eyes haunted him, the certainty in her voice echoed in his ears. He realized that arrogance had blinded him. He had brought the wrong woman to court, and in doing so, he had opened the door to his own undoing. The story was not over yet. The verdict had not been given, and the final decision was still to come. But deep down, he already knew that the ground beneath him had shifted forever. The untouchable image he had built for himself was cracking, and soon, it would shatter completely. The final day of the hearing arrived, and the courtroom was filled with quiet anticipation. Word had spread through the town about what had happened in the last 2 sessions. People who had once whispered in fear of the officer now came to see how his case would end. The seats were full, the air thick with curiosity. Some came because they wanted to see justice, others because they could not believe the man they had known for years was finally being questioned. The officer sat at the table, his uniform pressed as always, but his posture told a different story. His shoulders were tense, his hands restless, and his jaw tightened every few minutes. The pride he once carried so easily had turned into a weight he could barely hold up. He tried to steady himself by staring at the badge on his chest, reminding himself of the authority it had always given him. But even that small comfort felt weaker now, as if the shine of the medal no longer carried the same meaning. Across from him, the woman sat quietly, just as calm as she had been from the beginning. Her presence filled the room not with intimidation but with certainty. She didn't look at him with anger or revenge, she looked at him with the composure of someone who trusted the truth to speak louder than any force. That calmness was almost harder for him to face than outright hostility. The judge entered, and the room settled into silence. Papers rustled, pens were lifted, and everyone leaned slightly forward. The officer's heart pounded in his chest. For years, he had walked into rooms knowing he would win. Today, he wasn't so sure. The woman spoke first, summarizing her case with clarity. She reminded the court of the inconsistencies in his report, the exaggerations in his statements, and the evidence she had presented that told a very different story. She didn't raise her voice or add dramatic flair, she simply laid out the facts, one after another, until they formed a picture that was undeniable. Then the officer was given the chance to defend himself. He stood, straightened his uniform, and tried to summon the commanding tone that had once silenced crowds. He spoke about his duty, about respect for authority, about the need to maintain order. His words were practiced, but something in his delivery faltered. His voice wavered, his eyes shifted, and his arguments no longer carried the same certainty. It was clear to everyone listening that he was not as confident as he once had been. The judge listened patiently, but the questions that followed dug deeper than before. Why does your timeline not match the witness reports? Why did you leave out details that were later confirmed by evidence? Why were similar complaints filed against you in the past, yet never fully addressed? Each question was like a stone placed on his shoulders, and he struggled under the weight. Spectators watched closely. For years, they had seen him walk through town untouchable, but now they were watching a different man. They saw the unease in his eyes, the cracks in his confidence, and for the first time, they saw him not as a figure of power but as a man facing consequences. The woman's final words echoed in the room, "The law is not meant to protect those who misuse it. It is meant to protect the people from misuse." Her statement was simple, but it carried the strength of every fact she had presented. The silence that followed was heavy, the kind of silence that settles before a decision is made. When the judge finally spoke, the words carried the weight of finality. The officer was found guilty of false reporting and misconduct. His badge was to be taken from him, his position revoked, and further investigations would be opened regarding past complaints. The verdict landed like a thunderclap. The officer sat frozen. For years, he had believed this day would never come. He had thought himself untouchable, protected by the power of his uniform and the silence of those around him. But now, in front of a full courtroom, that illusion shattered. His badge, once the source of his pride, now felt like nothing more than a piece of metal. As he stood slowly, the room seemed different. The whispers of fear that had always followed him were gone. In their place were whispers of relief, even quiet applause from those who had long waited to see justice done. He looked around and saw eyes that no longer avoided his stare, eyes that looked at him directly, without fear. That, more than anything, told him how far he had fallen. The woman gathered her papers calmly and walked out of the courtroom. She didn't look back, and she didn't need to. Her dignity was intact, her truth spoken, and justice served. She had stood against the man who thought himself untouchable and shown that no one stood above accountability. The officer remained behind, his world crumbling in silence. He thought about the choices that had led him here, the small moments of arrogance, the times he had used his badge for pride rather than service, the people he had silenced instead of helping. One by one, those moments replayed in his mind, each one now heavy with regret. Walking out of the courthouse later, his steps were slower than they had ever been. The streets that once cleared for him now felt crowded with eyes watching. Some people shook their heads, others whispered to each other, and a few even smiled faintly, not out of cruelty but out of relief. For them, justice had finally touched the man who had always believed he was beyond its reach. That night, he sat alone in his small apartment, the uniform folded neatly on the chair beside him. For the first time, he realized how much he had hidden behind the badge, how much of his identity was built on fear and arrogance rather than true service. Without it, he felt exposed not as a powerful figure but as a man who had lost his way. The story of his fall spread quickly, not as gossip but as a reminder. People spoke of it in coffee shops, in offices, and in homes. They spoke not only about the officer but about the woman who had stood against him with calmness and truth. Her courage gave others courage, and slowly, the community began to change. People learned that silence was not the only option, and that even those who seemed untouchable could be held accountable. For the officer, the lesson was harsher but clearer. He had once believed his badge made him a shielded man, above question and beyond reach. But in the end, it had been his pride that had destroyed him. He had underestimated the power of truth, and by bringing the wrong woman to court, he had brought himself to his own downfall.